Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, August 2nd, 1980, Ronald Reagan arrives in Mississippi, where he will speak at the Neshoba County Fair the following day. Reagan had become the Republican nominee for president a few weeks earlier, and this was, in many ways, his general election kickoff event. The speech he would give would cause a controversy, particularly for its use of one two-word phrase. We're going to talk about that phrase, the location of this speech, and since this is our Sunday election-y edition, we'll talk a bit about the 1980 election in general, Ronald Reagan's first campaign, and how it may help us think through this year's election. Here, as always, is Nicole Hammer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hey, Jody.
And Kevin M. Kruse, history professor at Princeton, is back with us. Hello, Kevin, and happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday.
Kevin, where a candidate chooses to kick off his or her campaign, whether it's the primary campaign or the general election, I think tends to be a pretty big signal of what kind of campaign they're hoping to run. And in this case, there was a lot of symbolism packed into this one event. So it's the Neshoba County Fair, which is in Mississippi, as you mentioned, a place where politicians, particularly white Southern politicians, had spent a lot of time in the preceding decades. And that two-word phrase that you mentioned, Jody, states' rights, is one of those phrases that can be unobjectionable in certain contexts, but in this context has a particular meaning. And Kevin, could you explain to us what meaning emerges when you combine Neshoba County Fair with states' rights?
It's important that Reagan kicks off his general election campaign at the Neshoba County Fair, because the Neshoba County Fair takes place just outside Philadelphia, Mississippi. And Philadelphia, Mississippi was infamous, even in 1980, as the site of the murders of 3 civil rights workers in the Mississippi summer of 1964. Jim Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner had been brutally murdered there with the complicity of local police. And so that phrase, states' rights, and the spin that Reagan puts on it during that speech, where he says that there were a lot of domestic issues which need to be left up to state and local forces, that resonates all across the South as a phrase used by segregationists. But in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the local police have been complicit in the murder and cover-up of those civil rights workers' assassinations, that phrase really seems to stick out.
Yeah, and I think it's important that, we could nitpick about the use of certain phrases in certain places, but this is a place that the Reagan campaign specifically chose in order to go get what one of the campaign strategists said was the George Wallace vote. This idea that you were going to get the Southern racist white Democrat to vote for the Republican rather than for the Democratic candidate. And this was in many ways a play and in many ways a dog whistle, as we can talk about, for exactly those voters.
But explain that dog whistle a little bit more. What does saying "I believe in states' rights" specifically mean in this context, as he presents it?
States' rights is sort of a libertarian code for white racism in a lot of ways. And why is it that? Because the federal government was being called out again and again to the South in order to protect the rights of Black people. After the Civil War, during the Civil Rights Movement, states' rights was about saying, no, get the government out of here. We'll take care of our own racial affairs.
Well, soon after the speech, Andrew Young, who'd been a top aide to Martin Luther King Jr., wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post where he really explained how what he called the code words of states' rights and the setting of Philadelphia, Mississippi meant to him. And he recalled that in 1966, King had gone to Philadelphia, Mississippi and given a speech. And at that speech, King said, you know, the murderers of those 3 civil rights workers are probably within earshot of my voice. And a man called out, yeah, we're right behind you. So that phrase, states' rights, and that location, Philadelphia, Mississippi, if you had one or the other, I think it might not have set off the alarm bells. But to have those two in combination, and as Niki noted, to have it as the kickoff of the general election campaign was just unmistakable to a lot of people. That here was a Republican candidate who had been a strong backer of Goldwater in 1964, that same summer when Goldwater had voted against the Civil Rights Act and the civil rights workers were killed, to come down to Neshoba, Mississippi, to campaign on a promise of states' rights and to leave locals to their own affairs as the kickoff moment really struck a lot of civil rights workers, at least, as an obvious sign that Reagan was trying to win over the white Southern conservatives who might have hated the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I think Goldwater is a really important figure in this conversation because it's Goldwater who in 1964 says, you go hunting where the ducks are. And the ducks he saw were not in the black vote. He didn't believe that black voters were going to stay with the Republican Party. So what you had to do was go after the racist white vote. And Goldwater votes against the Civil Rights Act. And he does so with a sort of libertarian instead of an openly racist argument. And that gets us on the path both of a Southern strategy for the Republican Party to try to pick up white Democratic Southerners, but also why you start to get to this language of states' rights.
Right. And Goldwater himself claims that he's in favor of integration in his book, Conscience of a Conservative. He says that he favors integration on a private level. He thinks it's all well and good for school children of different races to get together. But he says the federal government has no right to force Southern states to adopt that policy. And for segregationists, that's all that matters. And that line that he was simply promoting a kind of a libertarian view of what the government could and couldn't do is one of the things many of his supporters cling to even to this day. But we have to remember, at the time, Goldwater was on the ground in places like Mississippi talking to the White Citizens Council's radio show in 1959, appearing before segregationist audiences, applauding Strom Thurmond for his filibusters against the Civil Rights Acts, for his party switch in 1964. Goldwater praises him and welcomes him to the GOP, that he was fine with segregationists. And he had been seeking to get the George Wallace vote in 64. And so it's no surprise that Reagan seeks to get the George Wallace vote, as that Mississippi councilman said, in 1980.
I want to read the quote in which this phrase appears because I think it's interesting to sort of parse the context in which it lies. So Reagan says, quote, "I still believe the answer to any problems lie with the people. I believe in states' rights. I believe in people doing as much as they can for themselves at the community level and at the private level, and I believe that we've distorted the balance of our government today by giving powers that were never intended in the Constitution to that federal establishment." So overall, that's a very Reagan-y sentiment, right? Government is the problem, not the solution to our problems. And then you have just this, like, I believe in states' rights, kind of like wedged in there. Does that show us that it was really a dog whistle, a sort of throwing something out given the particular context and sort of couched within something that maybe he believed or was trying to run on at a more fundamental level?
Yeah, again, I mean, that general sentiment, this is why the context is important. That general sentiment is one, but I think if you were to read that quote and picture it happening to a city council in San Francisco, right, or to a club of businessmen in New York, it would sound much different. But those words said to that crowd, said to a virtually all-white crowd in rural Mississippi, meant something rather different. And Reagan knew it. And all of his aides after this speech, after Andrew Young's denouncement, after President Carter calls him out for this speech, and Carter does so from Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, after all these voices have said, hey, that states' rights phrase is a code word for racism, for segregationists, a lot of Reagan's defenders come out and say, oh, no, we didn't mean that at all. This wasn't an appeal to segregation. You got it all wrong. States' rights is just a general principle we believe in. The problem is that a lot of the people who are making this argument for Reagan themselves in the past had supported segregation. So Carroll Campbell, who was a representative at the time from South Carolina, a Republican representative, later becomes the state's first Republican governor in 1986, gained fame in 1970 for being the spokesman of a group that was trying to slow down the pace of integration in the South. And so this phrase states' rights certainly meant something to people like Carroll Campbell, whether they wanted to admit it to the public at large or not.
And Reagan already knew he had vulnerability on this issue. So just the week before, the Ku Klux Klan had come out and said, hey, this Republican platform coming out of this convention looks great to us. And Reagan had to disavow the Klan's sort of endorsement of his candidacy. So this was a high-risk proposition in some ways because he was leaning into a negative narrative about the campaign already. And that tells you how important it was to him that he got that phrase in there because he knew exactly what he was opening himself up to, but he believed that's how he was going to win the election.
And a lot of his advisors tell him, you can't go there. You can't make this speech there. And he waves them off. He'd been invited down, interesting, by Trent Lott, who has his own interesting history of racial baggage. And Lott convinces him that this is a speech you have to make it in this place.
Right. Just to sort of give some of the context of the reaction to this, sometimes you use a dog whistle and you actually hope that only the people who it's intended for hear it. And everyone heard this, right? I mean, you look at newspapers immediately jumped on it around the country. Politicians immediately, as you said, Carter immediately jumped on it. So it's not like they were trying to maybe pull one over. Maybe they were, but it certainly didn't work. It was very clear what they were going for. Niki, you mentioned, the Southern strategy, which was basically the Republican Party's electoral strategy to increase support among white voters in the South, often by appealing to racism. We think of that as something that comes up through the 50s, 60s, 70s. Should we think of this? And then, for instance, if you look at Mississippi, and Mississippi voted for Carter in the election before, and actually only ended up voting for Reagan, but not by that much. So where does this moment and Reagan's candidacy in 1980 fit into the larger picture of the Southern strategy?
Yeah, I think one of those things when we talk about the Southern strategy, people think that the Civil Rights Act passed, and all of a sudden the Democratic Party was the party of civil rights, and the Republican Party was the party of opposition to it, and all of a sudden you have a solid red South. The process of the South becoming Republican takes decades. It doesn't become really Republican until George W. Bush in the 2000s. I mean, if you look at the electoral maps in the 1990s, at least on a national level, it's changing in different ways on the local and state level. But Bill Clinton is doing fine in the South as a Southern Democratic governor in the 1990s. So this is part of a long process. And Reagan, again, he's looking for those votes. He knows that they're available. It's been clear since 1948 when the Dixiecrats volted from the Democratic Party and picked up some of these southern states that that's a real vulnerability in the Democratic Party. So he's fulfilling a process that, again, just is taking decades.
Yeah, and as Niki said, it really starts right after the Dixiecrats. The Republicans are talking about going after the Dixiecrat votes, these votes of disaffected white Southern Democrats, and picking them off. Right after 1948, there are all kinds of talks from Senator John Bricker and Senator Carl Munt about combining the conservative Republicans and the Dixiecrats together, maybe in a new party, maybe ditch the Republican name because Southerners still associated with the Civil War. The head of the RNC goes down in 1952 to Alabama and tells them, look, Dixiecrats and Republicans, we believe the same thing, so you guys should vote for our party. So this recruitment of white Southern Democrats is underway from the 40s, but as Niki says, it doesn't really finally complete until the early 2000s. It's a long process of unwinding that long-standing commitment that Southern whites have with the Democratic Party. And it's a process, as Merle Black and Earl Black have described, that really begins from the top down. And it's the president that really peels this away. So you really start to see it with Goldwater, who in Mississippi picks up 87% of the vote in 1964, which is phenomenal. It's his best state. In 68, George Wallace is running as an independent. He steals it away. Nixon gets it back in 72. It's his best state in 72. Watergate derails this process, and the Democrats nominate a born-again Christian peanut farmer from Georgia who captures the native son vote of the South. So he wins Mississippi back in 76. Reagan takes it in 80, 84, 88, it's gone. It's now a solid Republican state. And so that process starts there at the national level. And Reagan's campaign in 1980 is part of this long-term Southern strategy. The political scientists Angie Maxwell and Todd Shields have a great book called The Long Southern Strategy, which link that 1960s Southern strategy with later repeals. They highlight anti-feminist campaigns and appeals to the religious right in later decades. But they argue it's all part of one approach. Reagan denies this at the time. There's a great famous interview with Lee Atwater in 1981 with the political scientist Alexander Lamis. And in it, the audio is available, you can find this. In it, Atwater admits freely that the 1960s Southern strategy that Goldwater and Nixon used was, as he said, based on coded racism, right? Mm-hmm. He insists that in 1980, Reagan had nothing to do with that there was no coded racism there. Obviously, I think scholars would say his states' rights language was a lot like the stuff Goldwater and Nixon pushed in 64, 68, and 72. But they deny that it's part of that continuum. It really is, though.
One more thing on this speech, and then I want to talk about where we are right now and this kind of coded language as it exists in our politics right now. But one thing, looking back at this speech, I read what Reagan did say, and we've been talking about what he did say. It is worth pointing out what he didn't say, which is he never acknowledges the civil rights movement in this speech. He never acknowledges the deaths of those three workers that happened, not that long ago. And so, sometimes it's just as important to recognize what doesn't get put on the table as does. I don't know exactly how to phrase this question, Nick, but we've been talking about the Southern strategy, and we tend to think of it as something that we just extended it into the 80s. I'm starting to wonder, how much it just sort of is an ongoing through line throughout American politics, because right now, you could argue that there is still a Southern strategy of sorts being employed by Donald Trump. I mean, he is taking the side of the Confederate flag. He is using this kind of language. He's very much, I think, aligning in the same ways. I don't know if he's used the phrase states' rights.
He doesn't need coded language.
So, how much is the Southern strategy over, and how much does this kind of language still permeate our politics?
I would say in two ways. It's not over, but it's changed. And one of those ways is that the Southern strategy is no longer just focused on the South. I mean, this was always true. Like Wallace was up campaigning in Wisconsin and trying to get the white racist vote there. And this is sort of a through line now, right? That you've already got a lock on the South. You don't necessarily need it here. You can expand it to places in the North. The other way is that the language isn't as coded anymore. I mean, one of the things that Donald Trump did when he ran for office was he dropped the dog whistle and he picked up the bullhorn. And that's something that you see in his strategy here as well. Like he's not using states' rights at the Neshoba County Fair. He's using shithole countries on Twitter.
Right. Or Confederate flags at NASCAR races or whatever. Right. I mean, I know this is a much bigger thing that we will touch on at some point, but I do think your lens of Southern versus Northern is, that's maybe disappeared, and it's more, I don't know if the divide is really rural and urban or, along education and so forth. But, again, I will point out what a lot of people have pointed out is, you're just, in many ways, you're just as likely to see a Confederate flag in a rural part of the North or the Midwest as you are in the South these days. And so it has switched. I guess it's the sort of language and the appeal is the same, but the geography of it has shifted. Is that right?
Yeah, I would also add, and Kevin, you might have some thoughts on this, that the states' rights argument or the Southern strategy now is more explicitly neo-Confederate. And what I mean by that is, like, when Pat Buchanan ran in the Republican primary in 1992, he doesn't go to the Neshoba County Fair. He goes to Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is basically the Confederate Mount Rushmore with engravings of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. And he explicitly starts talking about Southern segregationists and how wonderful of leaders they were. And I think that Donald Trump, too, uses that explicitly Confederate symbology and arguments and deep personal defenses of the South as part of his appeal.
Yeah, and it's really unusual for, again, both those guys, Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump, to wrap them, I say this as a Southerner, to wrap themselves in the South like that when their own personal experiences had nothing to do with the South. And so I think they see in the Confederacy, I'll give it the most charitable reading, they could see a kind of a traditionalist. Nikki's eyebrows are raised. I see. They could see a traditionalist America. They could see a very old-fashioned sense of we'll call them values, but it's a really odd fit, and it's one that they have to force themselves to make, and it doesn't fit well, I think, on Donald Trump. I mean, in a lot of ways, watching Trump try to make this pitch as kind of the champion of the Confederacy was like watching, Richard Nixon borrow lines from George Wallace back in 68 and 72. It didn't sound as authentic, but yet Trump is trying it. And as Niki said, we're not dealing with dog whistles anymore. It's bullhorns. It is incredibly obvious what he's trying to do. We saw this in Statements about Charlottesville, right? We've seen it in the fight over the Confederate monuments and the support for the Confederate flag and NASCAR. I mean, NASCAR is more progressive on this issue than the president who was from New York City. It's really a bizarre place to be in right now.
And, I will add one thing, which is, when you're using a bullhorn, people hear it and they react. And, one of the reasons actually this came up for us and we wanted to do this episode is because we started thinking about this, Niki, when Donald Trump had scheduled that rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma on Juneteenth at the site of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And there was pushback and there was an understanding of the symbology around that. And you and I were chatting about that moment, and you brought up this speech by Reagan in 1980 as another moment where that symbology crashed. So, I think we're both using bullhorns, but we're also more attuned to it, and there's more pushback, and we're sort of all out in the open, and we're having that conversation. As we start to wrap up, any sort of final thoughts about how this fits into the 1980 election in general, and then I guess like Reagan's presidency? I mean, I don't think of the 1980 election as sort of one that played out along racial resentment terms. I don't think of Reagan's presidency as one that hinged on that. Maybe this forces us to rethink his presidency, or how do you see this fitting in?
Well, it certainly recovers the white South for the Republicans. It corrects what they all had insisted, and I think we're right, that 76 was an aberration. And the South had been locked up by Nixon in 72, and Reagan reclaimed it in 80 and 84, and Bush again in 88. And so the solid South becomes solidly Republican. The racial angle is certainly there. There are certainly real objections the civil rights leaders have to the Reagan record in the 80s. It's not usually something we think of in the foreground with his administration, but the complaints are certainly there at the time.
Yeah, I mean, try to think of this as kind of the kinder, gentler racist policies of the Reagan era, because what this shows us is his early facility with this kind of dog whistle politics. And that could be him talking about welfare queens, but then also the policy consequences of that, which is scaling back welfare that could help poor families and people of color, as well as, his belief that, okay, we'll give you the civil rights movement in the 1960s, but civil rights has just gone too far. And so his stance is against things like affirmative action. And so I think it helps us begin to understand the way that racist policies would weave their way through the Reagan administration and why he doesn't necessarily have, generally speaking, a rap as a racist among most Americans.
In 1984, Roger Wilkins of the NAACP writes an editorial for The Nation called Smiling Racism, which is all about the way in which the Reagan administration, in his view, had put a positive, happy face on racist and discriminatory policies.
All right, we're going to leave it there for our Sunday edition, talking about the 1980 speech at the Neshoba County Fair. Thank you, Kevin M. Kruse, for joining us for these last two episodes. This was really great. So where can people see your work?
I'm everywhere you don't want me to be. Okay. Bookstores, social media, who knows? I may show up in your backyard and read something.
And Nicole Hemmer of Columbia, thanks to you as always.
Thanks so much, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Thanks to everyone who has reached out with comments and potential topics and reactions to our new Sunday editions. They are all much appreciated. We read them all. I try and respond to them all. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. There's also a contact form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
I know that in speaking to this crowd, one has to be about 90% Democrat. I just meant by party affiliation. I didn't mean how you feel now. I was a Democrat most of my life myself, then decided that there were things that needed to be changed.
Radiotopia.